Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do.
In this episode, I interviewed David Colarusso, co-director of Suffolk Law's Legal Innovation and Technology Lab, whose journey from physics teacher with 6 million YouTube views to public defender turned data scientist has reshaped how the next generation of lawyers think about AI. Welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm Tom Martin, your host. I'm really excited today to have David Colarusso on. David is the practitioner in residence and a co-director of the Legal Innovation and Technology Lab at Suffolk Law. Also a colleague of mine. I am an adjunct there, and David has just been amazing in his contributions to not only like an understanding of AI and technology ChatGPT and a very deep understanding of it, but also like educating and communicating to people what to be aware of, and also to educate students about, the right ways to use technology. I'm just really grateful for you to be on today, David. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Can't wait to see you in person soon in 3D.
That's right. The Lit Lab conference that's happening next week, right?
Yeah. Although I don't know when this will air, but for other people, you can find the videos online. We'll put them on our YouTube.
Yeah, actually, this will be coming out a little bit afterwards, but we'll have a link to all of the great sessions and videos for those online. Right now, you're just outside of Boston?
Yes, my appearance is different to the contrary, but yes, I'm outside Boston.
There's a lot going on right now. There's so much change in the air, especially with regard to AI. There's like all of these different models and techniques and frameworks that come out. Anthropic dropping a model that they say is too scary to even let the general public use. With all of these considerations, you have a class of law students that you're teaching about the pros and cons of all this. Off air, before we started, you had mentioned about automation bias, and I thought that might be interesting for everyone to hear about. So what is that? How does it come up, and how are you exploring that with your students?
Yeah, I did. I had a sort of an interesting opportunity just a couple weeks ago. I was asked to sub in for a colleague of mine. They were going to have to be out and they wanted me to take over their class. They hadn't done a unit on algorithmic bias and ethical issues around AI. Decided I would volunteer for that. Sort of the freedom of subbing in for someone else's class is that you get to sort of have a blank slate to sort of play with. And so I spent actually like 3 days sort of vibe coding up simulations for the class so that we could have experiential learning take place in the class that I was just going to parachute in and do some stuff and jump out. And I sort of walked in and was like, you don't really know who I am, although I knew a couple of students from other places. But I'm gonna ask you first off to just sit down and we're going to spend 20 minutes doing doc review. And I have this tool that I've made. It's this AI assistant tool. What it's going to do is we're going to imagine that you're in a judge's chamber and you're helping them cite check some briefs. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see the language from the brief. Made it so we have this little AI assistant, and it'll tell you whether or not the proposition is supported, that's cited for. And it has some different bells and whistles. So, first there's like a top level. You can dig in and you can look at the actual language in the brief. You can look at some more information about the citation. I said, and so that that, we're all in the boat together, I'll do it with you. And so I sat down in the front of the room and with my back to them so they could see I was doing the same thing. And we just did 20 minutes through. And there were lots of little pernicious things in there. Like they were paired with a pacing buddy that said like, oh, so-and-so is, this far ahead of you. Your pacing buddies, this far ahead of you. They've solved this many, whereas, you've done this many. So it was pushing them to sort of get it in the time frame. And I also told them I'd give them Dunkin' Donuts gift cards. Well, I ate Dunkin' Donuts gift card to the person who got the best score. And the score was basically a measure of sort of a balance between you get points for sort of being accurate, but also points for being fast. And so I was trying to incentivize them basically to sort of, to take their time and think about it, but to move through as fast as they could. And then at the end, we all finish and we upload our results. And lo and behold, it gets revealed that we weren't really looking at the AI tool. What we were doing was we were looking at how they interacted with the AI tool. And almost all of them fell victim to something that's called automation bias. And so this was a way that I was able to sort of teach them about that, but without having to just say it to them. And basically, automation bias is this tendency when people start using a decision tool to sort of over rely on the tool or take the tool's answer to things as being more salient than their own thoughts about it. It was sort of a way to sort of get them to see, oh, it's not just something that people talk about, it's something that I could experience. And so that was a little way that I was able to sort of, really drive it home, I think.
Well, that's really useful, I think, for everyone who's watching. Like, if we could drill into that a little bit more. So what was the actual automation bias? Like, what was the thing that they were doing within that lesson or exercise that was showing that they were leaning towards automation?
Yeah. So what we were looking at if they were accurately marking the proposition as being appropriately supported by the citation. Basically, we had a corpus of lightly fictionalized texts that they were looking at, and there was this AI tool on top of it that was designed to be accurate most of the time, but had some difficulty with certain jurisdictional issues. So it tended to not differentiate between persuasive and authoritative sites, and it had some problems that were mostly cabined to certain types of citations. And so what ended up happening was that the students they were basically presented with 3 buckets of citations to work through. And it was timed so that they would make sure that they would get to all the different buckets. And the first bucket basically was a situation where they were learning what the tool was doing, and the tool was working in areas that it was very happy with, which is to say that the tool at this point was 100% accurate. So the bot was always right. And so what students did is they would look and see, and some of them would do things like open up information to see, okay, what does the text of the actual brief say? What does the text of the actual citation say? And so they could get more information. But they learned very quickly that they could rely on the bot. And so they were very happy to start then doing less of that opening up things. So to give you for instance, in that first bucket, it was 100% accuracy for the bot, and the users with the bot's input were about 79% accurate, which means they took the bot's input and, you know, some of the time they took it, some of the time they didn't. Overall, they ended up being 79% accurate. They didn't open up the extra information about 65% of the time. So that means 65% of the time they just looked at the bot's recommendation, but the rest of the time they did a little more tuning. And then the next bucket moved over, and then what happened is their accuracy went up. So the bot's accuracy stayed at 100%. The student's accuracy then jumped up to 85% because now they knew they could rely on the bot. They were doing that. But interestingly, the amount of times they did not double check the bot, that also increased. So it went from 65 to 80%. And then in the third bit, we have this sort of regime shift so that now the bot's actually dealing with citations that are of a slightly different character than they were before. And the bot's accuracy drops to 70% in that scenario. And then what happens is then everyone dropped down to 65%. Now they had started off at 79, then they went to 85, and then in this third regime, they went down to 65. So the students ended up being worse than they were originally when the bot was helping out, and worse than the bot. And then here's the kicker. The amount of times they looked for more information in that third regime went up to 84%. And that's sort of on total. Almost all of them had a scenario like that. But what you saw is that they learned to trust the tool, and then that the regime in which the tool performed the way they thought it did shifted, and they did not reevaluate their assessment of the tool, and so became over-reliant on it to a detriment to their accuracy. Oh, but I was paying such close attention. And then some people might say, yeah, but I wasn't paying close attention. It was 20 minutes. It was boring. I'm like, exactly.
Such a practical, like, examination of using AI, and the fact that you went through each and every one of those scenarios and like actually measured it, so they could see for themselves what the drop off was, what the reliance was. This is a lesson for all uses of AI, not just within, researching specific legal issues. Ethan Mollick talks about the jagged edge. There's some things that the AI is really good at. There's some things that it's not so good at. And actually, when we looked at that graph that Anthropic put out about the things that Claude is good at right now and the things that remain to be done, there's quite a gap. But for those things it's good at, we could get used to it doing a good job. And then what you're saying is that naturally, what we do as human beings is kind of get acclimated to that proficiency of the model. But then when it goes to that jagged frontier that it's not as good at, that we've already created that habit of reliance. And then we go down the same road, but then we can end up in a situation where we actually produce a worse output than we would have on our own. Is that generally right?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, Moloch's Centaurs and Cyborgs in the Dragon Frontier post was actually one of the things that they got shown at the end when they got to that screen. So everyone got individualized breakdown of their performance within their different regimes, and then there was additional readings there for them that they can then access after class. And so this was sort of a really weird and artificial situation. And I might do this again in my own class, but since I was coming in as a guest speaker, they really didn't know what it was other than it was, something related to AI and error or something or other. I thought I would sort of take advantage of the fact that there hadn't been any prior reading to get them to engage with something and sort of say, I suspect that in previous years, when I tell my students about things like automation bias, that they just say, oh, well, that's a thing that happens to some people, but it would never happen to me. Right. I'm going to be the one who's really close and looks at everything and makes sure that it's right. And I'm the one who's going to use it responsibly. And that's fine. But as you've just said, the problem with a lot of these tools is they sort of upset our traditional signals for what represents quality. And so, the halo effect, as it were, sort of says, oh, well, it's good here. We think it's also good here, but that's not a reasonable expectation. And then we also talk about how this can go the entire other way. So there can be algorithmic inversion, such that you can have a situation where, despite being shown that an algorithm can be better at something, you might not trust it because it's an algorithm. So the context and the framing ends up being really important. And I just wanted folks to realize that they are not immune from being human. And I wanted them to have an experience where they could point back and be like, oh, yeah, I remember that time.
Well, that's a really good lesson for everyone to learn. With that, though, I do want to get into your backstory because I want to get to know you better. I'm sure the audience would love to learn more about your origin story. So we'll come back to the interesting, like, current topics later. David, right now, like, you're in Massachusetts. Have you always been there? Like, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up all over the place. So I was born in Texas. Then we moved to New York. Then we moved to New Mexico. Then outside DC. Then I went to school in upstate New York. Then I came to school here in Massachusetts. And I was here for a while. And then I went and I taught a year in Scotland. And then I came back here. So yeah, moved all over the place. Most people didn't follow up and say, what branch was one of your parents in? And I say the Park Service. So we got to move from one beautiful place to another beautiful place, which was a nice thing about my childhood.
I mean, in itself, like I've talked to a few guests that have lived in different places, and one of the things that they've remarked about is that experience actually gave them the ability to make wherever they were at home. Like it was, in one sense, a number of places, but being able to feel at home and make friends wherever that place became.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's just interesting is that it sort of changes it's your sort of default setting, and so you're like, oh well, yeah, people when the job asks for it, you move to get a better situation, and that was just sort of the default, like, oh well, you move for this, you move for that, and which is very different than people I know who have lived here for a very long time, and it's like, oh well. Maybe you've only ever been away from home for 4 years at school or something, and so yeah, just really it does provide a different perspective. But of course, it also meant that, I get to say that, when I was 5, I lived on a national park for a brief time while we were waiting for the house in town to be ready. Right. So, like, it created a lot of great memories.
So what did your parents do? They were park rangers?
No, so my dad was in the National Park Service, or at least he was when I was younger. He worked in facilities. So he helped to make sure that things ran and that everything was working. And then my mom was a high school English teacher when I was younger, and then eventually became taught at the university level. To say that my dad just worked for the Park Service is not also entirely correct, because he was also, the entire time I was a kid, he was a naval reservist. He worked with the Seabees. And he actually met my mom back when he was in the Air Force briefly for 2 years. And so my parents were both civil servants. They both had a real sense that, your job can be something that can give back. Your job can be something that makes the world a better place. And so, yeah, so there was a lot of that in the house, and probably helped explain some of why I'm where I am now.
And do you come from a big family? Do you have a lot of brothers and sisters?
I am an only child, alas. So it is just me.
Well, you mentioned that, there's a few different places, but what's a childhood memory that you have of growing up? Like, what was the neighborhood like where you were at?
I mean, my parents always wanted more kids. It just was one of those things that wasn't in the cards. So I think they were very aware of the fact that I was an only child, and so always tried to make a situation such that I would have ample, peer groups. And so scouting ended up being a really big part of my life as a kid. And so, a large sort of the plurality of my life was spent in southern New Mexico, which for those of you on the video feed, this is actually a family property in the mountains right above where I spent most of my time as a kid. And my wife and I got married right there, which I know for the audio listeners doesn't do much, but it's it's a cabin. There are some aspen trees. It's pretty. And so most of my so a lot of my memories are of down the hill here in the desert in New Mexico, out near this is where my dad was at White Sands National Park, now National Monument. I'm sorry, forget which way that went. Yeah, which it turns into it changes designation. So now I think it's a park. It was memories of running around in the desert, doing a lot of hiking and camping with the scouts. The city downtown's Alamogordo. It's outside Holloman Air Force Base. People who might have heard the term White Sands before might have heard it in relationship to the missile range, which is sort of an interesting thing because it's such a small town. We didn't have an orthodontist in town, so you have to drive 2 miles to your orthodontist. And when you do that, though, you have to call ahead and you have to say, well, are they doing a testing over the road? Are they firing a missile over the road?
Oh
And
no.
which is when they would stop, but they'd stop traffic, so you could only go out when they weren't doing testing. So it was sort of this childhood that felt very much like I was sort of growing up in the era of sort of the space race and rocketry. And so I did a lot of model rocket building, just a lot of time with my friends and the scouts and camping. We'd go out every month and do some adventurous thing, and I don't know, just a lot of running around and free to explore, and it was nice.
It sounds like a great way to grow up. And I get the visual of like around nature, obviously the park, but also underneath, especially in New Mexico, like a very beautiful night sky where you could see into the heavens and think about it. And, when I was reviewing your career and, your schooling and all that, you've definitely carved a very individual path. And that starts, with Cornell because you put together a program for yourself. It wasn't just I majored in this or I majored in that, but you combined physics with film and art and made your own major. How did that come together? What was the influence that led you to kind of create this beautiful like taster's platter of different interests?
Cornell as an institution, its motto is I would found an institution where anyone could find instruction in any, I think it said in any subject or anything. And so because that's the motto, they have an institutional commitment to letting people be able to study whatever the heck they want. And so if you decide, I want to study a thing, and there does not yet exist a program of study for that, they allow you the option to create one. And so it's, I would say, pretty rigorous setup in that you have to prove to them that it can't just be handled by, doing a double major, or it can't just be handled by doing something else, that it really has to be its own thing. And so I thought I was being very clever, and I wanted to call my major the film major, which was sort of physics, PHYLM, physics and film together. I was just a little too early, although I did have a lot of success later with YouTube, but it was really, I was sort of majoring in, online video effectively is sort of what I ended up being, although there wasn't really online video then. The eventual thing on my transcript ended up saying physics education via presentation and popular media. I think that was the actual thing in my transcript. And so basically I said, well, you know what? I really love physics. I want to tell people about physics. I want to teach people about physics, and I want to meet them where they're at. And so I want to use tools like film to get that across. And so I said, well, you know what? This looks basically like a physics core of classes to me, and like a film production core of classes, and then a lot of things to stitch them together. So art, anthropology, history classes, all mixed in, so that you be able to figure out how to tell these stories to people. And that came about just because I wanted something that would let me sort of scratch all the itches. And because I think my problem has always been I've been interested in too many things. And so that was one way that I was able to sort of fold stuff all into one.
You went on to Harvard Graduate School of Education, and then used that to go on to teach. And you had a career prior to going to law school, and that was teaching physics and astronomy to students. And, you know, when I look at that in your experience, you literally brought all of that together in what you were doing because you were teaching in the more traditional way in a classroom, but you also had, you know, like a YouTube presence where you had over 6 million viewers of your videos about physics, right?
I would make these little explainer videos. I called it the tabletop explainer. So basically sort of things that would be physics demos in class. I'd sort of like film them. This was back at the time. I think I had like a flip camera, you know, or something. It was, you know, it was very early YouTube. So, well, I said those sort of became really big, I suppose. I don't know, did YouTube start? 2005, 2006? So around that era, and I do these little explainers, and I sort of sometimes I'd make animations to go with them. I adapted my undergrad sort of thesis project, which was an explainer on quantum tunneling. Those got a good amount of views. That sort of came out of this work I was doing in my classroom already, though, because I was having my students. This was sort of back before MythBusters was a really big thing, doing basically MythBusters with video. We take videos from, you know, like look at, you know, get the DVD from Speed and take it into the computer and sort of analyze and say, like, you know, could the bus have made the jump in Speed?
Right.
And I'd have the students do these projects where they would bring in the video and they do analysis, and then they'd put together a project that, you know, with their take on things. You know, it was one of those things where, like, I'd go to the, you know, the shutting down video stores and get the DVDs, you know, buy a bunch of them so they'd have DVDs they could use. Just like, oh, well, here's, you know, let's do Speed, let's do Fast and the Furious, let's do whatever. And it will not surprise you. That is when I first learned about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And you might start to see, well, now where things are going to change.
What a wonderful way of like you being able to express yourself in teaching students, but also like engaging them in a way that feels relevant to them and exciting. I think that, you know, the question that comes to mind for me and probably people watching this is that sounds so awesome, and that you were clearly really enjoying yourself and how you were teaching. And I think that carries over to how you're teaching now. But there was a moment then when you're like, I'm going to go to law school. And for people I interview, there's like one of two ways that that comes about. One is little kid likes to argue, and everyone's like, oh, you make a great lawyer. And like from a young age, it kind of made sense. And there's others that it seems more practical, like, okay, I'm going to go to law school because I want to make a decent amount of money to support a family or what have you. Like, how did that come up, especially within the context of what you were doing?
I went on a Fulbright teacher exchange to Scotland. And so the Fulbright teacher exchange program is actually the oldest of all the Fulbright programs. And the Fulbright program, although the current state of it is a big question because of our current administration, but it was Senator Fulbright basically said, you know, we think that the world would be a better place through one-on-one exchange, which is that if we have a person go to a country and get to learn about that country and other people can learn about them, that's a good thing for society and that it's a way to help us understand each other. And so the first one they did is they implemented a teacher exchange. And in the teacher exchange, what happens is you go and you teach someone's class and they come and they teach your class.
Okay.
And so I went and taught science classes in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and at my counterpart came and taught my classes. At that time, I'm there, and as you know, I think a lot of people, if they're lucky enough to have the opportunity to live abroad at some point, it's a time when you get to think about a lot of things. And so a couple of things sort of went together there. To make this clear, the decision to become a lawyer, it hit me when I was in Scotland. So actually, so much so that I took the bar down in London that year when I decided, because you can actually, there are a couple of international places you can take, and not the bar. I mean, I took the LSAT down in London. So there are a couple of places you can take the LSAT when if you're thinking of applying to law school in the States. I was doing all these things like the project I told you about, where I had my students sort of do things on top of copyrighted material, and so I had to sort of become like an expert in copyright law to sort of understand, like, am I allowed to do this?
Right.
Who's going to get in trouble? You know, is my school going to be okay with me doing this? So I had to think a lot about that. I had also, in the interim, started up a small business on the side with a friend of mine from undergrad. We were sort of a online, you know, shop where we would build different things for different people. And so starting our own business, that was a thing that sort of got me to see the law. And I also started this was, I guess this was 2007. And as you know, I was part of the YouTube community because I was making these explainer videos. And at the time, YouTube really did feel like a social network at the time. It was a community of people. And you may remember, anyone who was in the States around that time may remember the big sort of CNN YouTube debate, So there was the presidential elections, and they were going to, have people ask questions. This was preceded by a couple of projects by YouTube to sort of get questions from the YouTube community for people who were running for president. And me and a couple of members in that community were like, well, wait a second. All these different projects people were talking about was basically coming in and saying, oh, give us questions for so-and-so, and then we'll cherry pick which questions we want to ask of the candidates. And we said, well, wait, no, that's not the internet way. If you want this community, then what you should do is you should not only ask for questions from the community, but ask which questions the community thinks are important. So we threw together a website that was called Community Counts. And what we did is, in one of these sort of free YouTube debate things that YouTube was doing, we basically looked at all the videos that had been submitted, and then we put them up on a website and allowed people to vote on which ones they wanted the answer to. And then said, hey, candidate so-and-so, we think you should answer these 3 questions because these are the questions the community actually cares about. And that meant that when the YouTube debate came up, we had the infrastructure in place because things weren't tagged in a way that you could easily sort of search all the questions. So when the YouTube debate came up, we were in a position to be like, oh, we can just point it at that, and we can say, here are all the videos that have been submitted for the CNN town hall. So for like a week, I was the expert on YouTube political videos because I knew what all the questions were that people had asked and no one else did. That turned into a thing that we ended up doing with my company, where we would do these online bubble up forums where basically people would say, okay, we want to outreach to a community. We're going to let them ask questions. Then we'll let that community vote up the questions they want. And then here's the kicker. And then they have to respond, the candidates respond, and then the community could vote on whether or not the candidate answered the question. Not whether or not they liked the answer, but whether or not they answered it. And the idea is that it would commit the candidates to, if they wanted to engage with this community and have them feel as if they were being heard, that they would actually have to engage with them on their terms. Did that project with a bunch of folks, and we did that at a couple different places. We did some U.S. Elections. We did it in some elections in Central and South America. Anyhow, the point is, all this stuff was sort of happening. And I was like, oh, you know what? The law is this string, this thread that ties through all the stuff that I find important. Maybe I should pull on that. It is about the time they had just announced public interest loan forgiveness. If you went to law school and you ended up working in government or nonprofit afterwards, that you'd eventually be able to get your loans forgiven. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to go and see if there's something I can do with the law. I know I'm going to work in government or nonprofit space. So that was how I was able to afford to do it. And I decided to sign up to take the LSAT, took the LSAT, came back, taught another year at the high school where I was, because that was sort of the Fulbright thing. Like, you're going to go away for a year, come back, and you have to do another year after that. And then I went to law school and became a public defender. That was a really long-winded answer.
No, that's great. That's exactly the kind of understanding of how it came about that I was hoping for. Because you're right, like sometimes things don't seem connected, but if you take the time to really take it all in and what motivates us, like what is the thing that really gets us started, gets us up in the morning, and it seems like it came together for you at that point that the common thread was the law, going to law school, working to help essentially access to justice even at that point. So one thing I want to congratulate you on is it's 10 years now, right? This year, it's going to, I think in September that you'll be at Suffolk.
Yeah, as I was at an adjunct for a couple of years before we started the lab, which is another story. My 10th fall of classes with Suffolk students was this last fall, I think. But that's not quite 10 years at Suffolk full time because I was an adjunct before.
So how did that come about? The turn to like academia and to teaching. It sounds like you started with the practical background and experience that you've had teaching as an adjunct, and then that evolved.
It's funny because I actually, when I went to law school, part of that was I wanted to figure out where I could do the most good. And I thought the law, like I said, hits all these things that I found important. And so there must be something there. And part of it also was like, and I can simplify my life. I thought, you know what? I'm too interested. I'm in all these different things. I have a business on the side. I'm teaching. I'm doing these other things. Let me just find one thing that's really important and I'll work on that. And I thought I would, so I became a public defender, which is a great honor to be able to wake up every day and say, I'm going to work and I'm going to help make sure someone gets their, constitutional rights. I started working at the public defenders. And this is, I mean, everything's just sort of a longer story than I think. But I guess this is the podcast and I'm the interview person. So people, if they don't want to listen, they don't have to. But it was about 2012 at this point, and I've been at the public defenders for a while. And there was this big drug lab scandal that happened. There's a chemist by the name of Annie Dukin. She had basically been, so for those of you who that doesn't mean anything to, basically, if you're going to charge someone with the crime of possessing some substance, you have to prove that the substance is what you say it is and not, baby powder. And so samples, the police would send samples to a crime lab where it would be tested. And Annie Dugan was one of the chemists there saying, this thing, yes, this is cocaine, this isn't cocaine. But it turned out that what she was doing, she was like, oh, this didn't come back as cocaine. Let me take something from this other sample and put it in here. And now it tests positive. So like really egregious, really cooking the books. And so this sort of malfeasance came to light. And there was no magic button that anyone could push to figure out what all the cases were that she had touched. So the lab couldn't tell, the DAs couldn't tell, defense attorneys couldn't tell. And so we were all asked in the defense bar basically go back to our paper files, as it were. We had paper files and look for drug receipts. So where she had signed them. So basically figure out what cases she had been involved in so that we could figure out who was entitled to relief. And that was sort of a formative moment in that, I'm sitting there, with the entire office, we're sitting there and we're all going through our paper files, spend some time going through these hundreds of paper files just to see, is this one person's signature on a piece of paper, and thinking, oh, well, we are imputed by the state with all this knowledge of our clients, so much so that, you can get conflicted out. In Massachusetts, we have a hybrid system. So there are staff attorneys who do public defense and then contract attorneys, and that's for the conflict purposes. So about 400 staff attorneys at the time, and covered about 20 or so percent of the criminal cases. The rest by 75% of all the cases were indigent. So another big majority was to the contract attorneys. We had some of the clients who were affected, obviously, and we were expected to understand, everything in their case, but we didn't have a way to get at it. And the DAs didn't have a way to get at it. And the drug lab didn't have a way to get at it. And so I got involved in helping our agency with that litigation and ended up asking questions about how we use our data and how better to use our data. And it was one of those things where it's like, wait a second, I thought I was simplifying my life. And I thought, I'm going to leave that part behind. And so that ended up, you ask questions, you get volunteered for things. And that ended up with me becoming the data scientist at the public defenders here in Massachusetts. And in that role, I started doing some writing for Lawyerist. The ABA had a hackathon, and the ABA had the hackathon at Suffolk, and Suffolk was right next to the Office for the Public Defenders. So I went down for the day for the hackathon, ended up competing in that with some people I met there. Actually, and that was one of my first interactions with Suffolk and legal tech stuff there. And then eventually it turned into an adjunct position where I taught some classes, and then that turned into me eventually going there full time. But actually, I didn't actually get to the proximate cause of that. So, but I'm going to stop talking because I said too much.
Well, Suffolk, especially now, just seems like a perfect fit for you. Like I've called it like the all-star team of legal tech. You have Quentin, you have Gabe, Diane O'Leary, Sam Glover now. It's just this really great team, and you have LitCon every year, but you also have the program, the Lit Lab, that is helping law students right now to understand this changed environment that they'll be coming out into. And I think, for example, the automation bias lesson is a good lesson for all of them. From your perspective, with teaching students about this changing environment, a lot of them are worried about getting jobs. Do you think that that's a legitimate worry? It's kind of hard to tell the future, but is there a place for them in the coming years?
I mean, there are different things that can make you anxious about future employment. Sometimes it's, the economy and what it is you need to be able to pay off the loans that you got. There are sort of those larger sort of economic forces, societal forces, which I think are always going to be stressors. But I suspect part of the undertone of that question was like, is AI going to get, eat attorneys' jobs, or are things going to change and transform so much that's something they have to worry about? There's definitely a place for my students who go out into the workforce, and largely I look at that from coming from my background and the background of the other people in our group. We're all sort of public interest attorneys. Because of that, we recognize that there's this really large unmet need for people to have access to people who can help them navigate the complexities of the legal system. Now, I don't want to make the mistake of thinking that access to justice means access to an attorney. In fact, some of the tools we make recognize that that's not always the case. But the point is, there's a need there, and attorneys can help address that need. So I think there's jobs enough for them. The question is, what do those jobs look like? The majority of attorneys in the U.S. don't work in big law firms. They're smaller, solo. And so the question is, are we preparing students for that reality and for the ability to be able to sort of meet that need, and also, keep the lights on? And to that end, I think that a lot of the sort of change we're seeing is change can be scary. The short answer is I think it's going to be okay. I'll stop there because I've been doing a lot of monologuing.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I think that the example of the automation bias example that you brought up at the top of the show basically points to how people are still needed, and like especially those human beings that are cognizant of that interaction with AI and automation and what it means and what the shortcomings are, and to have their eyes on the goal of providing the client with high quality representation. That there's still a need there that can't be met just by the AI alone. One thing I want to mention to the audience, though, is that you have many varied interests, even beyond what we've talked about. Sadly, not Havoc Dinosaur. Like you showcase some of, David's also like an artist, some paintings on there. I think you also make furniture. You definitely keep yourself busy with a lot of irons in the fire. And so one of the questions I want to ask you before our time's up is, with all of these various interests going on, like, how do you keep a work-life balance? Is that possible?
So this actually goes back to part of the origin story. So one of the things when I was in Scotland is you learn very quickly that people outside of the US do not define themselves by their jobs. So if you meet someone new, the first question isn't, "Oh, what do you do?" It's some variation of, what are you interested in? And it's a little bit rude to ask people about their work. And so one of the things I realized is I was in a very privileged place in that I got to decide what I wanted to do with my life. And so deciding to go to law school was about choosing an opportunity to do good with the work I did. And so in that respect, I'm very lucky that it got to be an intentional part of what I chose to do. And when you choose to do something, that sort of work-life balance question, I think the calculus changes a little, because this is part of what you chose to do. As far as balance, though, you also alluded to some of the other things I do to maintain it. I like to take walks. I do a lot of watercolor. I think it's important to read poetry. Taking time to think about things and to live an examined life and to appreciate beauty. I think those are ways to deal with balance, and to find that in your work and elsewhere. I feel very privileged. So I don't know. It's not a trick that you can use to do the balance, but I've been very lucky that I've had the opportunity to find that balance. That's the answer I got at the moment.
No, it's a good one. I mean, the examined life is worth living, right?
It is indeed.
Which leads me to the last question. When you're involved in all of these varied interests and working with students and technology and all of it, what makes it worthwhile for you?
So in the professional sense, it mostly is my students, right? I mean, I've been a teacher in many different guises, and being able to interact with people and help them to sort of lead that examined life and to question what it is they want to do and how it is they want to look at the world, and give them a tool set they can use when they go out into the world to make the impact they want to make. I mean, that's I suspect the reason I get up in the morning and do most of what I do. I can also have the benefit, since we do experiential education, is our students tend to build things that actually serve people out in the world. So I also get the added benefit of knowing that not only am I helping my students, but my students and myself through proxy are helping other people out there in the world who are facing difficult times. And then I also get to, scratch my own curiosity and understand how things work in the world. I mean, I always like to joke, I went from, nature's laws to people's laws. And one of the things that's nice about people's laws is, unlike nature's laws, where when you deal with physics or other sciences, you're basically sort of describing how the world works. Our laws are not set in stone. They're not the weather. We can do something about them. We can change them. They're aspirational. They help us make the society we want to make. And knowing that I'm a part of that profession is also a place that gives me great meaning.
Well, that's a great place to end on a very hopeful and positive note that I think is what we all should focus on, is the good that we could do in the world. And I want to thank you, David, for all the good that you've been doing.
Thank you.
And for everyone who's watching that wants to keep in touch with you or learn more, how could they do that?
Well, you can find the Lit Lab at suffolklitlab.org. You can also find it on Blue Sky at suffolklitlab.org. You can find me at davidcolarusso.com, the website, and that's also my handle on Blue Sky as well. You can see some of my watercolors there as well.
And just one question I have to ask you, the very last one. Sadly not Havoc Dinosaur. Where did the title for that come from?
Right. So I have a couple of web properties, and there's the eponymous one, which is where I share my art, but on Sadly Not Havoc Dinosaur, I share some of my writings. And that came about because when I was in college, I put my full name into an anagram generator. And it turns out that Sadly Not Havoc Dinosaur is an anagram of my full name. So, my first name's David, my last name's Colarusso. I'll leave it to the reader as an exercise to figure out if they can figure out what my middle name is. But it was just such an evocative image. Then I was like, oh, I got to have that domain. So I grabbed that domain, and now it's a place where I do some writing.
There you go, audience. There's the secret unraveled. So for all of you watching, thank you so much. See you next time. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to LawDroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.